Good
Your
morning.
reaction, first and foremost, if I can please, to kind of these developments we're seeing in Israel regarding those plans to fully occupy Gaza City.
Well, the situation in Gaza, in Israel generally, is shocking, of course. And, something needs to be done to bring this to an end, this conflict to an end. Of course, we're concerned about the prospect of what may be an escalation. We need to see more detail. But the reality is, at this point in time, is Hamas are still in charge of Gaza. That's not a sustainable situation, and there's no other plan on the table that can bring that situation to an end. So something new has to happen, and that has to lead to a reduction in civilian casualties and the actions happening in Gaza and some of the actions in the West Bank. So we need to see a resolution. We need to see more detail behind this. But what we don't want to see is an escalation. But people have got to remember there are still 50 hostages captive in Gaza held by Hamas. That's not a sustainable situation. And any kind of unconditional ceasefire or recognition of the Palestinian state, as Keir Starmer is suggesting, has got to be wrong at this point in time. And this has got to be a deal that releases those hostages, that means that Hamas will have to lay down its arms and depart the government of Gaza. That's what's got to happen. I've not seen any other proposal on the table that will do that.
The proposal currently from the Israeli Prime Minister, some say, would lead to the displacement of 1 million people from Gaza City. The families of hostages being held have been protesting in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. They're worried that it will bring about further harm to their relatives, that potentially, if cornered, Hamas will kill the remaining 20 or so that are estimated to be alive. There's widespread condemnation of this current proposal. You say nothing else is being proposed at the moment, but the reality is if 61,000 plus people have died since this conflict began, and obviously it started with that terror attack, the international community, UK government, UK politicians like yourselves, the Americans really do need surely to have an uptick in their efforts, because this is being dragged on far, far, far too long.
Well, there's lots of upticks in efforts going on, both by the UK and the US and other allies. But the reality is Hamas won't agree to any of those proposals. With a number of peace deals on the table, all those peace deals rely on Hamas laying down their arms, and they will not. So the situation, of course, it's not a situation we want to see ongoing, but what's the solution? There is not a clear solution there that means that Hamas will leave Gaza, and then the people of Gaza will be able to run their own territory. That's what needs to happen. So, of course, we want this to an end, but it's got to be a sustainable position, and it's got to mean those hostages are released and that Hamas is no more. I mean, Israel is fighting for its life in that area, fighting for survival. That's a reality. So we can all opine from the sidelines from here, but that situation is far from easy, and we need to see a solution right across the piece that deals with all these issues.
Kevin Hollinrake, you used the phrase Israel's fighting for its life and fighting for its survival. You'll be very aware of the pictures that have been broadcast around the world of millions of Palestinians who are fighting for their lives and fighting for survival. And I'm sure you'll understand that some of our listeners, some of our viewers will have winced slightly at that turn of phrase from yours, because the reality is when you're blockaded from the sea and all three corners on land, Palestinians have very little choices in front of them at the moment. And the only choice currently, really, is to either be displaced or scavenge for food.
Well, listen, I also am shocked by what's going on in Gaza, of course, and Israel needs to do more to prevent loss of life and casualties, and I said that earlier in our interview. Of course, I want to see an end to that. But that end has got to also see an end to Hamas. That's the point. And, the history of Gaza and Israel and West Bank, all these go back decades, in fact, centuries. So we can't take a simplistic view in this interview about how we resolve all those things. But you cannot have a situation that territory is governed by a terrorist extremist organisation. That's the situation today. The figure you just quoted at 61,000 is a Hamas figure. How can we trust that number?
It's a figure that reportedly is being used by the Israelis themselves. It's figures that after previous incidents of conflict was checked by UN agencies and is found to be generally watertight. And on the lack of any other data, that's all we've got to go with. And I appreciate your comment, but until someone provides us other data, that's what we're left to use. I want to turn our attention to stories a little closer to home. You yourself are a landlord, you rent out properties. Would you ever evict a tenant and then see the rent increase, as we've allegedly seen with a government minister this last few days?
Well, not by the level that Roshnara Ali put it up. I mean,
Not by the level, but you're not saying no.
Well, the law as it is allows the landlord to end a tenancy and put that property back on the market to rent. As I understand it, that option was not given to these particular tenants. That tenancy was ended and the rent was put up by 20%. That's an extraordinary set of circumstances. But I think the point in this is that Roshnara Ali and the Labour government has promoted and is legislating for changes that prevent landlords doing this, and moralised against landlords who do increase rent in these circumstances, which isn't currently illegal. But when you say one thing and do another, that's what makes your position as a minister completely untenable. This is not a backbencher for Labour. This is the homelessness minister who is stood at the dispatch box and talked about the exploitation of tenants and how Labour's going to fix that in a way I think is going to be very detrimental to tenants. But nevertheless, that's what they've said they will do, and then not abided by that in practice. That's the reality. It's a case of saying one thing, doing another.
Are you opposed to no-fault evictions? We'd like to see them continue to be able as a tool for landlords, or do you think that they should be got rid of?
The legislation as stands today that Labour's proposing will reduce the numbers of properties available for tenants. That's bad for tenants, it's bad for rents, it'll put rents up. That's exactly what's happened in Scotland where they did the same thing. So the legislation as proposed today, we are totally against. We voted against it in Parliament because it will have that effect. And I've had decades of experience in this business, and I promise you that's exactly what will happen.
You entered Parliament in 2015. Theresa May, spring of 2019, the government of the then Conservative Party was proposing banning no-fault evictions.
Well, I thought that was a mistake. I was on the backbenches at the time, and I said that in the House. This was the wrong thing to do because it sounds good in principle. In practice, it's a very bad idea. I started in the property game about 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago in York, and your choice of properties to rent back then was a couple of very dark, damp, shabby terraced houses because landlords, you would not invest in the property market. Today, you have 5 million properties to rent in the UK, and that's good for tenant choice, a doubling of the choice in pro rata terms that we've seen in the marketplace today. And particularly small landlords will be very badly hit by this legislation. It's the wrong thing to do. But the point with Roshnara Ali and the government is doing one thing, saying one thing and doing another. That's what she's guilty of, and that's why we call for resignation, and that's why she had to resign.
You kind of make those allegations around the minister there, Ms Ali. You will be aware that some people will want to accuse kind of the Conservative rank and file in Parliament of some degree of hypocrisy, maybe to some degree, or a vested interest, because 72 of your MPs have derived more than £10,000 from rental incomes. And they'll say, well, look, hang on a second, you know, you're benefiting from a situation, of course you don't want to change it.
Well, that's nonsense. People on either side of the House rent properties. Roshnara Ali herself, you know, we want to do the right things. There's a delicate balance to be struck between the landlord and the tenant. So you get bad landlords, you get bad tenants. That's the reality. You need a system that's fair to both sides. But I don't think it's fair to both sides. If you say to tenants, you don't ever have to move, and a landlord can't get their property back, which will deter investment, which will lead to a reduction in supply, particularly for smaller landlords. That's why it's a mistake. So I'm not on one side or the other. I want fairness in the system. But you move into a system that's less fair, will mean less choice, which will mean increased rents, and that's bad for tenants.
Joining us live from North Yorkshire, Kevin Hollinrake for the Conservatives. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.